Hello, my name is Holger Haibach. I'm the country director of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for Croatia and Slovenia. I'm very happy to have very good informed guests here, and what we are going to discuss today with the help of the Pan-European Union Association in Croatia is the question of Ukraine. So I would like to start with Mr. Vidmarović. What is the idea of Vladimir Putin to go to war with Ukraine? What do you think is the idea that he has, and what does he want to achieve with it?
Hello, thank you very much. Well, it's the question that bothers each and every one of us. It's a very difficult question because it has so many layers to it. On one hand, it sort of reminds me of the old geopolitics, the protection of core territories. There is even a certain amount of Lebensraum to it, definitely to a certain degree. But on the other hand, the reason for the war, it doesn't lie in food security, it doesn't lie in expansion of territories, it doesn't lie with religion, with ideology. It has none of the classical reasons for waging a war. This is something new, and it gets harder because it's not an idea of Russia as a state, government plus society per se. So it's not a national idea. It's an idea and cause of a very narrow group of people, Russian elites, Russian security elites, and Vladimir Putin himself. One of the obvious reasons is neutrality, Ukraine's neutral status in NATO. So we could call it war for neutrality, which really doesn't lead us anywhere in our analysis because it's a sort of a senseless reason to wage a war, because it could have been done with diplomatic means. It could have been avoided. The war could have been avoided. And we are left with the idea of Russian elites and Vladimir Putin trying to reverse some of the outcomes of the Cold War, and some of the injustices perceived from their side, some of the injustices of not being incorporated, not being given a fair share of say in European security, in the forming of European security, ignoring interest, expansion of NATO, and all sorts of reasons we are familiar with. And on the other hand, it's also a desire to, in order to fix those things, set an anchor which will be movable in the future. So as I like to describe it, Vladimir Putin is currently, he's standing on two legs. One leg is in the past. It's Russian Empire, it's Soviet Union, it's post-Cold War frustration. And with the other leg, he's standing in the future. He has now gone beyond being a president. He sees himself, he feels himself as a man who is able to define Russians and European future. What happens in the present, it really doesn't matter for him. He is now setting standards, new standards for European security and security arrangement in the world via annexing territories, because whoever comes after Vladimir Putin, he or she might be the biggest liberal in the world, but there is no president who will give away annexed territories, right? And this will be, I presume, one of the conditions for normalization of relations between the West and Russia. So in a way, he's making, hostage every future generation of leaders that come after him. He's making them or her, a hostage of his current vision. So the nature is really trying to define the future, trying to force his vision, Russian official vision of Russia's place in the world, with this sort of paper cut, really, really bad paper cut, where you just slice everything up. You know, there is certain, I wouldn't want to go into, you know, psyche and all the things which are really, you cannot measure it, it's not scientific. But there is this line which I felt in Russia where I lived there is sort of fatalistic thing in many people whom I spoke with. They are hopeful to a certain degree. And when they reach their limit, they just say, okay, let everything go to hell, let everything burn. So there is also an element to it. But we also have to look at the pragmatic side. The pragmatic side still remains the same. Neutrality, enforcing, like wrecking Ukraine to a degree that it will not be able to join European Union or NATO for many years to come, ensuring that it stays in Russia's sphere of influence, even as a neutral state, and forcing Russia's way into strategic architecture of the world and Europe.
Well, thank you very much. I think you made a very important point here. Vladimir Putin was, as a lot of people always forget, a KGB agent in the former Eastern Germany, in the GDR. He was stationed in Leipzig, I think, and he, as you said, one foot in the past and one foot in the future. So, Mr. Rukavina, my question to you would be, were we really surprised, and did we not expect what was happening? Because obviously, I did election observations in Russia for some years, and one of the things that I always met was that a lot of Russian people think that Vladimir Putin gave them their pride back, being a superpower again, being a force to be reckoned with. So what did we overlook in that whole process?
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps we overlooked the whole context after the Cold War. Perhaps we thought that there was no war in the future, but there were wars in the last 30 years. There was Iraq, there was Afghanistan, there was Libya, there was Syria, and many of those things people assume to be far away. They are like far away different people. I certainly do not agree with this. We are all the same from my perspective. We are all made after the same matter, the blood, the bones, the flesh, and we all have the same interests. We are driven by our emotions, we are driven by our interests, and those interests can be different. We have passions, we have fears, we have hopes. In one degree, also Russia has the same. Anthropologically speaking, human beings haven't evolved a lot over the last few thousand years. We are the same. And because of that, this is this pessimistic look on human nature. We have been expecting the war. It shouldn't come as a surprise. But on the other hand, this positive thinking after the Cold War, that everything should be now rational, that everything should be now in harmony, that we should go to the economic side, not the war, then this is a surprise. Now, when we talk about this, it is very important to talk about context, and this is why I always like to emphasize the scientific work of Professor Skinner. He wrote an article about meaning and understanding in history of ideas. He told us that if you want to understand an idea, you need to put it into context. The same is with situations and happenings in the international level. If you want to understand Ukraine, you need to put it into a certain context. Now, after the Cold War, there have been predictions that this might happen on two levels. On first level is Ukrainian as a state. On the second level is Ukrainian as a subject of international relations. 30 years ago, Mr. Huntington, Samuel Huntington, professor, wrote a book about clash of civilizations. He wrote how in Ukraine there will be perhaps a clash of civilizations between the western part and the eastern part of Ukraine. He was talking about this civil war which happened after 2014. He even says in his book that there needs to be some kinds of measures to prevent this. There needs to be cooperation with Russia. There needs to be proliferation of nuclear weapons. Other scientists, like Professor John Mearsheimer, he's a statist and realist. He claims this is the wrong idea. The country should never give up of its nukes. Only 4 countries have done that: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and South African Republic. Now, the second level is, Mr. Brzezinski talked about it in his book, Grand Chessboard. He talks about Ukraine as a very important state in the Middle Europe, in the Central Europe, as a state, pivot state for reassuring any new reemergence of Russia as an empire. To stop that from happening, Ukraine needs to participate fully with the rest of the Central European states in Euro-Atlantic integrations, most importantly the EU and the NATO. Now, this, for the Brzezinski, will happen in 1990s, he wrote, between 2005 and 2015. It happened in 2004 with Orange Revolution and 2014 with Euromaidan. However, predictions are a bit difficult in international relations, but there are 3 more theses that might be worth to look upon. The first one is the newest one, diplomatic activities of Russian Federation prior to the invasion, prior to the intervention, from December until the February. The second one is Georgian War in 2008, and the third one is the constant warnings about enlargement of the NATO and Kozyrev doctrine. This was during the Yeltsins in 1990s. This means that nobody should interfere in neighborhood, close neighborhood of Russian Federation.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a very valid point. However, I would like to remind all of us that in 1994, Ukraine let go all of the nuclear weapons and got as a security the chance not to be touched by anybody and by anyone. However, the point that you made is very interesting, because in the 1990s we also had a scientific debate whether I don't know, I'm old enough to remember that, whether we are not reaching the end of history, because history seemed to be over. However, history obviously is not over, and the question that I would like to have for you is, my feeling tells me that Vladimir Putin also took the opportunity, or what he saw as an opportunity, of the West being divided. United States somewhere with a very conflicted government, UK out of the European Union because of Brexit, and the rest of Europe, elections in Germany, new government, elections in France not really being clear. Where does that leave us? What is the position of well, the EU has somehow made its point, but where does this leave us with the UK and with the United States?
Well, current actions tell us that Europe is really confused. It's divided and confused. There are a lot of antagonistic drivers inside the EU, which is actually logical. It was to be expected regardless of the Ukraine war. Because when you have large systems function in a specific way, we know that a small system, economic system or security system, is functioning well only if it has a clear hegemon. Hegemon, I mean in neutral sense, scientifically, you have a dominant power. Dominant power and several states that cling to it. They're bandwagoning with the dominant power. And this system functions well. It was the early NATO. It was the early European Union or predecessor to European Union economic European Economic Community. They were, very specific alliances, specific integrations. But then when you expand these systems, they become larger, they become more unstable. And as time grows, new hegemons emerge, or wannabe hegemons. You had, in the Cold War, you had just the US. Now, in late past 10 years to 15 years, we saw the emergence of other centers of power. The UK had its own vision, France had its own vision, Germany had its own vision. They were synchronized, but not always. And then what adds another layer of problem to the system, to the stability, is the ascension of other countries, which was known they will inevitably gain more meaning and power and influence, such as Poland, the Baltic states. And now we're at a problem because these different countries, especially the new countries to the EU, they are not historically and ideologically in sync with, in a value system, they are not in sync with core EU countries, with the old EU countries. Brussels believed, for example, that Polish opposition to the Soviet Union, the Polish desire to decommunize itself, that it means liberalism, political and ideological, but it doesn't. Polish had their own version of it, which is their own national revival, nationalism. So you had one huge country that was, there was a big potential, and we now see that Poland is really powerful economically and politically, but it has a completely different value system politically and culturally than, for example, Brussels or Luxembourg, Netherlands. And this is what creates problems. And now we see that Europe would rather give everything away to the US to mitigate it than to try to solve differences, because differences are now so complex during the bureaucracy decision-making process. We see now calls for the revision of EU treaty, introducing a qualified majority to vote on foreign policy issues. Where will it lead us? Which means that some countries will lose, actually, there will not be unanimous vote. So some countries will lose their influence. Those things would happen anyway, regardless of the war, because such is the logic when you enlarge constantly, and when other countries develop, they want their own fair share, they want their own place and influence. Baltic states wanted influence, they got it. Poland wanted influence, it got it. Same things will happen to Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo in the near or mid future. With respect to Germany, with France and the UK, it's really now obvious that UK is out of the picture in European political and security terms. UK is looking far away, together with the United States, across the globe, restoring its naval influence and power, especially in East Asia, which leaves us with two countries, neither of whom are really strong enough economically or strategically in terms of military to be leaders of Europe, which means that there are two different ways of developing this situation. Either Brussels goes down the path of restricting rights, of actually making the decision-making process more strict, more streamlined, and goes down the path of Chinesization of European politics, making everything a little bit more authoritarian in order to answer all the challenges in the world, or they go down the path of sort of federalization and leaving all the decisions, some key decisions to different member states, which is from today's perspective, a worse path to take, because the obvious trend is securitization of everything. We see that, the challenge of China and Russia is now leading us to to adopt censorship, to install digital divides, to censor certain elements of public opinion, to securitize, to think about our own European army, to think about our own borders, restricting migrations and stuff like that. So in essence, and even confiscating Russian assets. So in essence, we are sort of becoming, and the US is going down this path too, so we're sort of becoming like China. We're sort of asserting more governmental control. The government is now much powerful than business and the corporations. This is so obvious. So the governments will steer and the politics will influence everything. And this is our future for the time being. There is also another path which is also viable. It's USA outsourcing. If the USA senses that European Union will not steer away too much, the US it might and is now in the process of outsourcing the conflict with Russia to to the European countries, in order to gain more free assets to fight China in the East Asia and the South China Sea. If this happens, then it will lead to the creation of the so-called European army. I cannot now predict in what state will be, how it will be organized, but there is definitely an element to it, which we can see that Europeans might actually come to an inflection point which Russia insisted so long. Russia insisted that Europe should be independent. Well, it just might happen. Not in a way that Russia would like it to become independent from the US, but it just might lead to a greater emancipation of European Union from general politics in Washington. It doesn't mean decoupling, they will stay close, but it will free more resources in Washington to spend on China.
I would like to disagree, but I'm just the moderator here. I think the big difference between a nation as the United States are and the European Union is especially the two strong powers, Germany and France, will not allow their independence to be limited too much. They will see the necessity, I totally agree with that, but I'm not really sure whether they are now, for the time being, ready to give up enough of their independence to form something like a European army. It may happen in time. I totally agree with that. It may happen in time, but not for now. And the interesting thing is that you made that argument in your first intervention. If you look at the narrative that Vladimir Putin is trying to sell to the world and also to its people, in the beginning he was talking about denazification. He was talking about Ukraine being a complicated and difficult case. When he did his last speech at the 9th of May, he didn't mention that narrative at all. He was talking about a preemptive war. He was saying, we aggress them before they were able to aggress us. So what is the point? What does Vladimir Putin try to sell the world and try to sell to the Russian people in order to justify a war?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, if you look according to international law, the causes of war, there should be none, because the war is illegal. Any military means are illegal according to international law. But then again, this doesn't happen in reality. When Russia speaks about this war in Ukraine, it's like they are repeating the same narrative over and over again. First, like Mr. Vladimir said, it's about a NATO enlargement. Putin has said in his first speech when he announced this that he has asked the West to be part of the NATO. He was declined about it. I believe it was during the Clinton administration. Then he was talking about the danger of NATO coming close to the borders of Russia. This was actually one of the causes why Russia intervened in Georgia in 2008. Then again, does the Ukraine want to be part of the NATO? Yes, it has in its constitution, Articles 5, 102, 160 clearly defined their main goal is full-fledged membership in the EU and the NATO. For the Russia, this is of course threat. Then the Russians are also saying how these radical national extremists took the power over the Euromaidan. They wanted to Ukrainization of Russians in the Donbas area because of these language laws. Then they were talking about war crimes during the eight-year war in the Ukraine. We always forget that this is re-escalation of already happening war. The war was already in Ukraine for 8 years. It just wasn't in the center of the media. Around 15,000 people died in Ukraine from the 2040 until the February 2022. So another interesting point that it is right now in Russian media and scientists also, they are talking about how this war was actually provoked to stop greater strategic partnership between Germany and Russia, or between this industrial heart of Europe and this rich energy resources of Russia. This is like this long-lasting idea to divide the Euro continent. And it will be very interesting to see in the future. I perhaps a bit envy historians now, because they were going to read documents which Putin has read, the information that Putin has read when he made this decision once when the archives open. Some of those informations might be wrong. Perhaps they were wrong about this, this situation when they intervene in Ukraine, how they will be welcomed or how it is going to be liberation. Not sure what is in the documents. But another interesting thing that the main cause of this intervention is perhaps the clash of ideas, not civilizations, but principles. Two main principles, the principles of security and the principle of freedom. The principle of great power to feel secure in its place in international relations, Russia, and principle of freedom of Ukraine, a small nation which wants to have its own destiny, its own way of happiness, and without any other interventions in that part.
Could I just please
Yeah,
add some? I totally agree. I just wanted to add another layer. Russian propaganda is usually, when it does something, it doesn't know for sure how it's supposed to be done. So it's always testing some ideas and some keywords. I remember back in 2011-12, when there were huge protests going on in Moscow, Putin used the word banderlog, which is from Rudyard Kipling Jungle Book, to describe those people who are protesting. And it was so catchy and it was so good. The media really caught up with that and people understood it, and all the pro-Kremlin public in larger Russia, they were using the word and repeating it, they liked it. With the current situation though, there was this denazification, and I get the sense, and there are some writings among Russian expert community that this might be the case. They wanted to provoke a strong feeling, how to justify aggression, because it's really undefendable, because so many Russians have relatives in Ukraine, vice versa. It's really so interconnected, much more than we like to think about. So how to justify it? You use the strong word Nazi denazification. But suddenly it turned out that people don't understand it. They cannot pronounce it properly. They really, when you're far away, when you're uneducated, you're far away from Moscow, it doesn't ring a bell. It doesn't strike any emotional chord with you. So we see at the May 9th speech We see a complete reversal. It's going back to history. It's defending Russian people. So he's going back to the fundamentals which are more understandable to common Russian people, defending Russian people, Russian language, and then he makes long excursions into deep history of Russian military woes and tragedies and wins to build a case for the current aggression. So denazification was probably just not really well thought about, not really well designed marketing word.
Interesting point. I think if I look at the situation here in Europe, the word denazification sounds pretty removed. This is something that for the not for the Germans, because Germans will always be connected to that, but for a lot of other people, it's 80 years ago. But it still seems to ring some bells in some of the countries. Speaking from the German standpoint, what is perhaps the most important question, especially if you look at the situation in the European Union, 40% of the energy supply, oil, gas, come through one of the two Nord Stream, this Nord Stream pipeline. Ukraine has just decided to stop the deliveries. Energy prices are going through the roof. Do you think that that will finally have an impact on what the European Union does? What countries like France or Germany are doing? What countries like Croatia or Slovenia are doing?
There is a desire to remove dependency on Russian energy sources and develop renewables or find alternatives. But it's such a complex question. Sometimes politicians are detached from reality, from the mechanical and practical reality of doing things. It's much easier said than done because we have existing infrastructure which is built. We have complex delivery systems, trading systems, shipping. It was all during the course of years built and synchronized and perfected to a second so that everybody receives their fair share of supplies and that everybody has storages filled, and it was working well. But it also depends on the internal infrastructure of each and every country. For example, Hungary, why is Hungary against the embargo? It's not because they sympathize with Russian politics so much, it's because they've built such a good infrastructure for trading and handling and refining all this oil and gas. And it's tuned to receiving Russian gas and oil. And in this sense, it will take a lot of money for them to restructure everything in order to get their supplies from some other parts. Definitely this crisis, there was even before the war, there was interesting year in European energy where the winter was longer. China started to open their industry, so they demanded more energy, and Russia shipped it to China rather than to European Union. Plus, European Union decided to invest heavily in the wind turbines and solar energy, but it turned out that there was no wind. It wasn't a windy year, and there wasn't much sun anywhere. So it all, connected to a larger crisis, and now we have this. And this will be a problem. We see now that countries are thinking about, because each and every politician is elected among their own people. Is not elected from the US. So each and every politician has to think about its own voter base, his or her own survival. So there will be a lot of problems and a lot of debates on how to manage this, and we see that there are talks about prolonging postponing the embargo at least until the end of 2024, which is, by the way, the year that Putin is supposed to leave or stay. There are talks. U.S. is trying, and when we now see how it all connects to a bigger picture, bigger problems. We see now that the oil and the energy sources, the free energy sources, which might be used to power Europe, are in the hands of those who the West was systematically branding as terrorist or failed states or rogue states. And it's now becoming a problem. So if you want to get oil from those countries, you will have to legitimize their governments, which brings us, to a new construction of the world architecture, which will be really interesting. We have countries like Qatar who would like to. They found free supplies, free volumes of gas, but they would like European Union to commit for a long-term period, longer than 20 years. The European Union, again, doesn't want to commit too much. So there's a lot of negotiations, a lot of diplomacy, but in the end, there will be a positive outcome of all this. Renewable and green and high tech will definitely get more wind, and it will definitely develop. But it will take time. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It will happen over the course of at least 5 to 6 years, but we'll see definitely new technologies being developed. And again, this calls into question cooperation with China, because China is currently the largest producer of green energy and green energy technology in the world. So if you want to speed up the process, again, you have to enter into conversation with the country that you deem a rival antagonistic partner. Antagonistic country. And of course, last but not least, atomic energy, nuclear energy, which is being branded as a taboo, a bad energy in the world. But we now see that actually France is in a much better position, and France can independently talk about energy security, because its share of electricity is covered at least around 70% from their nuclear energy from reactors. Germany went the other path. Turkey, for example, is building its own nuclear power plant, HPEU, together with Russians. And they think it's going to be profitable, and they don't want to sever those questions. A lot of countries now are thinking about going back to nuclear. I mean, Japan, even before that, Japan had, right after Fukushima, the plan of getting the nuclear power back, increasing its share in the total production and output. So we will see shifting narratives and shifting opinions on a lot of things that we thought unimaginable, like liberalism, liberal idea. I think it's dying pretty much. My colleague quoted John Mersheimer, who said when he was in Australia, when he was talking about Australian security vis-a-vis China, he said, "We, United States, will pressure you like there's no tomorrow. We're going to put pressure like you haven't witnessed before. And you will choose security over prosperity." And people in the public were like, how can we do this? And he said, yeah, you live a good life, but in the end, you will choose security over prosperity. And it seems that, Mersheimer is always right. It seems like we are moving slowly in that direction towards increasing our everyday security.
Just one intervention, can I please? Yeah. Thank you very much. When we talk about liberalism, it is very interesting. If you look upon 21st century, there were three crises of liberalism. First one, the security crisis. It was 9/11, and when the twins fell down, and then there was happening this NSA and other things that Bush did, the war on terrorism, etc. Second was economic crisis. In 2008, then everyone was talking about how Marx was right, etc. Neo-Marxism were up. Third one was political crisis of liberalism in 2016 with Brexit and with Trump. now political correctness, who is actually winning in globalization, China or the liberal democracies, etc. And then happened COVID-19. It was actually a mixture of all those crises. Security crisis because of the coronavirus that was killing people, economic crisis because everything was shut down, and third, political crisis, of course, because there was no freedom of movement. So now this Ukrainian crisis is another threat for the liberalism. But it doesn't mean it is the end of liberalism, it's just a crisis.
I said a strong word, die, like Macron, brain dead. It's not brain dead, it's sort of in decay.
In decay, yes.
I agree to disagree. I'm a conservative, but I'm also somebody who believes in the idea of liberalism. However, I think you are completely right. And I have very long time ago decided to put the crystal ball into the shelf because I didn't see 9/11 coming. I didn't see the world economic crisis coming. I didn't see Trump being elected. I didn't see the Brexit. All of these things were before they actually happened, pretty unbelievable to me. So obviously, the world doesn't work as sometimes we want it to happen. The question, and we have to come to an end, unfortunately, because I could go on with you for hours. It's a very interesting discussion. There are two things that come to my mind. One is what you said, and we have a very big decision and discussion in Germany about it. How dependent are we on other countries? Supply chain management, for instance. I mean, there was a time in the beginning of the pandemic where German car producers, like Volkswagen, like Audi, like Mercedes-Benz, couldn't produce anymore because they couldn't get the spare parts from China. So there was this discussion on whether this just-in-time management was really the solution, or whether we should not have at least some spare parts in the shelf so that we can still produce when time has come. So the question that I have is, one, we are now sanctioning Russia. And we put sanction on sanction on sanction on sanction. Do we really believe that this will help? Will it produce a solution? And the second question that I have, and that is the more important one, and we talked about it before we started recording, at some point, this conflict, this war will end. And I'm not appeasement, not at all. But where will that leave Europe and Russia? That would be the question that I would like you to give, and I hope you're better with the crystal ball than I am, a prognosis on.
Thank you very much. Well, first, let's start with the sanctions, this economic part. Now, when we talk about the sanctions, there are two types of sanctions mostly used, the general one and specific ones. Comprehensive, the general ones, were used mostly up until 1990 during the Saddam Hussein and Iraq. This was the last general comprehensive sanctions, and it didn't quite work. There were many dead, there was a famine, and the population didn't uprise against Saddam Hussein, and he even gets stronger power, because to whom is going to people turn to if the whole state is under the sanctions, if the whole society is under the sanctions, then to the government, to the power. The second, and then they realized, all right, we can't sanction all the state, let's sanction specifically. Let's hit critical infrastructure and people who are close to the regime. This was happening until through the 21st century, and there were a lot of sanctions. Sanctions are actually rising through the 21st century. It was a great tool against the especially great powers with weapons of mass destructions, and which you cannot actually hit with military means. On the other hand, what is happening now in Ukraine? We have generalization of specific sanctions. How? First of all, there were specific sanctions already on Russia. It was from 2014, so Russia was under the sanctions. When the invasion started, when the intervention in Ukraine started, the first initiative came from the private sector. The private sector and entrepreneurship started to withdraw from Russia. This is because of their social entrepreneurship. They are feeling that there are some social ideas which they have to defend, and invasion is not one of them. We have to withdraw from the Russian market. And others were afraid of the cancel culture, or they are afraid of boycotts from the West if they stay in Russian market. Now, will sanctions hit Russia? In long term, yes, but we must not forget that a lot of regimes actually function under the sanctions as well. Iran was decades under the sanctions, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria. But the Putin has perhaps a bit different situation. Why? Because he's highly dependent on the export. So the export is actually the one that can hit Russia even more, especially on the energy side. Another thing is his popularity is increasing, but the data is then questionable because of the censorship and because there is no alternative to Putin. And another thing, we can look at the sanctions as an tsunami. First, there is an earthquake, but the wave comes later, a bit later. So in the long run, it may have great influence. And another thing, it is also connected with the fields of operation. Now to your second question about predictions. When we talk about predictions, I always remember my professor Rukavina. He always said to our students, warned us, the only constant in international relations is that it is unpredictability. Why? Because in the center of the politics are humans, and humans can be quite unpredictable. Now, when you talk about Ukraine, there are several groups of predictions that we can talk about. First is, I call them sudden end. This is death of Putin, Putin is sick, or the coup d'etat in Russia. Now, about Putin being sick and Putin being dead, this is questionable. The second one is up to God, and the first one, this is between Putin and his doctor. So it might happen, but we don't have any data on it. We don't have any proofs that it's going to happen. The coup d'etat also questionable. It might happen, like in any other country, but by whom? Who is going to lead it? What is the alternative to Putin in Russia? Another group is connected with the military operations on the field. So now we are going to battlefield strategy and the tactics. This is connected with the goals of Russia. Russia has several goals in this manner. Securing the territory of Donetsk People's Republic, securing the territory of Lugansk People's Republic, connecting Russia via Mariupol to Crimea, connecting Crimea and Russia via Odessa to Moldavia, cutting off in that manner Ukraine from the Azov Sea, cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea, destruction of military complex that can be used for WMDs or any other industrial complex in Ukraine, destruction of any other military equipment and infrastructure in Ukraine, and the last one, what Mr. Vladimir has already said, the main problem is that shrinking of Ukraine makes Ukraine unacceptable for the EU and NATO. The last group of predictions is about peace. So perhaps what we need a peace, a truce between Ukraine and Russia, and let diplomacy back in. This is also very interesting because for now, nobody is willing to do that because they are all thinking that they can win in the battlefield. But there won't be a final victory, I believe. I personally agree with analysts who say the one who is going to win the Battle of Ukraine is the one who's going to secure most of those objectives on the field. And or perhaps Mr. Vukadinovic was right, and something unpredictable might happen, like, for example, Yalta II. Great powers sitting down and making the new world order.
Thank you. Then briefly, our dependence on other countries. Yes, but that's why we are dependent very much, all of us. But that's why we are rich. That's why we are a developed world. Because this is the logic. We outsource, we find new places, we seek where it's cheaper. We are industrious people, and we grew up on finding the means of how to produce more cheaply and sell more expensively. Now, if you want to eliminate dependence on other countries, then you are going back to John Mearsheimer. You will choose security over prosperity. This is a John Mearsheimer episode. So you will choose security over prosperity. In other words, it is achievable to a degree because we are now at such a stage of technological advancements that it's impossible, not just virtually, but it's practically impossible to produce everything on your using your own resources. You don't. Neither country has all the resources. It has to cooperate. This is the problem now that society is facing. The Western society, if it wants to cut its dependence on China, or Russia, or whatever, it really has to make compromises and say, okay, we don't want this. We will choose security over prosperity. And this is the debate that will definitely shape the upcoming years on how to, and there will be a soft or harder classical geopolitical battle, I think, for Africa, for the resources of Africa, because it's still a continent where many powers, great powers, are intertwining, but there is really no big competition for that, as Chinese are dominating. But once the EU and the US together enter Africa, things might get interesting. Sanctions rarely work. We know that. We see that sanctions should be applied, very specifically in the right moment, just in time. And it is my belief that as soon as you see they're not working, they're not having desired effect, you should withdraw them, because what happens is radicalization of societies that are under sanctions. As sanctions are applied, they are put over, when they stay in place over time, they actually achieve the backfire effect on the countries which placed them in the first place. So we see that with Iran, we see that with North Korea, we see that with Venezuela and many other, we see that with Afghanistan. They are, unfortunately, they are not strategic gainers. They are open-ended, because sanctions usually have no end game. They are put there so that usually the belief is that societies will remove their tyrant from power. It doesn't happen. So they're really just radicalizing societies. It doesn't work. Short prediction, I don't know about this war. It might have so many different outcomes. I agree totally, but there might be a Yalta 2. There might be a Helsinki Security Conference number 2. We might have this sort of outcome. We might have a deal between, because we had deals in the past in Cold War, we might have a tacit deal or explicit deal between the Washington and Moscow on tit for tat. Bosnia might be a part of NATO and Ukraine might not be. These are all, political fantasies right now. What is certain, though, that the future of global architecture of security will now be defined by the global South, by China, India, by Islamic world, by African countries, and by Latin American countries, the way, and Turkey, of course, the way they position themselves to the current crisis, to the current great political schism between Russia and the West. This is how the security they will influence the security, because right now we see that the global West is very powerful group of nations, but demographically very weak and small. Demography is always something to remember. Demography is in Africa. Demographic boom is in Latin America. Those countries, 10 to 25 to 30 years, will become main consumers. They will develop. They will get richer. They will become consumers. They will become producers. And they are the ones who will, in the long term, define and shape security relations in the world. And it seems that it's going to be a very interesting hybrid period, because they are not leaning to any classical ideologies. They're not leaning to any classical schools of thought. They will yet see. They are now in the pragmatic stage. They're now driven by pragmatism, by regionalism, by desire to develop, and by desire to utilize multilateral platforms and instruments to get the resources needed for their security and development.
Thank you for opening up another can of worms and a Pandora's box. Having lived and worked in Africa and in Latin America, I can agree with you on one point. Europeans are very often very Eurocentristic. They still think that they are, the nucleus of the world, and they're not, obviously not. However, Europe, through the Ukraine war has come back into the picture in a way that nobody, I think, would have expected it to be. It was a very interesting discussion with the both of you, and we thank you very much for your contribution, because you both shone the light on some aspects that people might every now and then overlook. And I know that we cannot deliver the answers on what is going to happen. We cannot do it in 45 minutes. We cannot also do it in 45 hours. That's absolutely clear. But it was very interesting to hear what you have to say. And we thank the Paneuropean Union for the contribution that the two of you made. And I hope that we are going to be discussing in depth a little bit more in time. I know this is a difficult subject. We didn't talk about NATO, which is another very difficult animal. I mean, not only because of Turkey now saying, "Oh, we are not going to allow Finland and Sweden to join." I just heard last night that the Austrian foreign minister said we are never ever going to join NATO, which is quite interesting for an EU member state, which can speak from a certain point of security because it is in a geographical position where you don't have to fear too much.
You mean USA?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot of things still to be told and a lot of to be discussed, and I hope to see you very soon on this platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you.